Let's jump into my goals, outcomes, and solutions for the 2018-2019 school year. Feel free to pause as needed. My goals for this school year were to have 80% of students meet their AR accuracy goal and 80% of students meet their Wordmaster goal. The outcome at the end of the year was that I had 98% of students meet their accuracy goal and 82% of students meet their Wordmaster goal. Some causes of gaps in this school year identified were that parents and grade level teachers were not clear on student goals or how to utilize AR software. Students could not name whether they were on track or off track to meet their end of year goals. Top readers were unmotivated to continue reading, which was limiting growth in overall reading level once their goal was met early in the school year. And emerging readers had difficulty understanding what steps needed to be taken to reach their individual goals. The highest impact strategies and solutions implemented to address gaps this school year were to start the year with a backwards plan to include weekly checks for where students needed to be in order to be on track to meet their goals. Individual student tracking folders were then created to be updated weekly by students. There was a parent information session held in which I distributed and presented information about the AR goals, how to access the programs from home, and resources that could be used at home. This ensured stakeholders were aware of how to support their scholars and felt invested in student success. Throughout the school year, one-on-one conversations were had with critical students and students closest to meeting their goals to check progress towards those goals. Students were able to name next steps and strategies for the upcoming week that would put them back on track to meet their goals. And finally, new goals and incentives were created for students to optimize growth in reading level who had already reached both their Wordmaster and Royal Reader goals to continue their growth. We will now take a look at my goals as an AR facilitator for both academy and college prep for the 2019-2020 school year. For academy, the goals for first grade were to have 80% of students meet their accuracy goal and 45% of students to become Wordmasters. The result at the end of the year was that 98% of students met both their accuracy and Wordmaster goals. For college prep, the goals were to have 80% of students meet their accuracy goal, 45% of students to meet their Wordmaster goal, and for 15% of students to become Royal Readers. At the end of the year, the result was that 86% of students met their accuracy goal, 46% of students met their Wordmaster goal, and 18% of students met their Royal Reader goal. Some of the gaps identified this school year were that parents and grade level teachers were not clear on student goals or how to utilize AR software, as most students and parents were new to IDEA and were unfamiliar with the program. Students could not name whether they were on track or off track to meet their end-of-year goals. Emerging readers had difficulty understanding what next steps to take to reach those goals. And students weren't familiar with online resources once distance learning began, as they did not have access to physical books. The highest impact strategies and solutions implemented to address gaps this year were to begin with a solid backwards plan with weekly checkpoints that students could use in their individualized student tracking folders, along with weekly updates following that plan. I also began the year by aligning a plan with the hotspot facilitator so that we could create weekly hot lists to follow to work together to reach our goals. Throughout the year, one-on-one data conversations were held with students that were the closest to meeting their goals, and so that students could follow through with their goal setting and next steps. And finally, daily calls to parents were something that really helped push at the end when we went into distance learning. There was a lot of positive feedback and additional support provided through those phone calls that kept the parents invested. Now let's take a look at my goals, outcomes, and solutions for the 2020-2021 school year. My goals for 6th grade hybrid social studies were to have 90% approaches on the end of course exam, 60% meets on the end of course exam, 30% masters on the end of course exam. My results on the end of course exam were 92% approaches, 82% meets, and 77% masters. For 7th grade hybrid social studies, my goals were 90% approaches on the end of course exam, 60% meets on the end of course exam, and 30% masters on the end of course exam. The outcome of the end of course exam were that I had 75% approaches and 32% masters. The biggest gaps identified in this school year were that the attendance rates for the first semester were very low, as was the engagement in classes. We also had difficulty building relationships with students and parents online. Students were not consistently mastering their exit ticket questions, and there was some difficulty with communication due to language barriers and lack of reliable internet access. So it was difficult to help problem solve some of the tech issues students were having. Some of the highest impact actions and solutions implemented to address gaps in this school year were that elements of the gamification pedagogy was implemented to ensure that lessons became more engaging. So CFUs were integrated into lessons to increase student participation. There were multiple EdTech resources utilized to offer differentiation to students so that work would be submitted in a way that worked best for various learning styles, be it Flipgrid, Nearpod, Microsoft Forms, Padlet, whatever it was to keep the students engaged in online learning. I utilized breakout rooms in Microsoft Teams for peer feedback. This also helps with purposeful groupings so that students could also help with the language barrier that came up. And finally, analyzing student data through the year to identify the least mastered areas helped build on the reteach and scaffolding strategies that were implemented to recapture some of the students that had lower attendance towards the beginning of the year, so they could later master those objectives before the end of the year. And finally, this brings us to our current 2021-2022 school year. For 7th grade hybrid social studies, my goals were 90% approaches on the end of course exam, 60% meets on the end of course exam, and 30% masters on the end of course exam. The results from the end of course exam were that I had 95% approaches, 91% meets, and 87% masters. Some of the gaps identified were caused by students needing consistency with classroom and achievement expectations as we transitioned back to in-person learning. The low attendance from the previous school year created gaps in skills that needed to be retaught. There were a high percentage of students needing additional support with writing skills and language, and there was a lack of prior knowledge of US and Texas history, as many of our population are first-year students. Some of the highest impact actions and solutions implemented to address gaps this school year were that I began the year by providing guided notes and sentence starters, along with other writing skills that they needed to work on leading up to their unit exams as they were open-ended. I was very intentional with seating in groups of similar levels, high, mid, low, so that students could provide additional support to fill in gaps with their peers while we had discussions in a more student-friendly language, as well as providing that language support they needed with translating. I built off of the engagement of the gamification of instruction from the previous year and used interactive lessons to deliver the content and keep the students engaged. This also gave them the opportunity to use the technology available to them to provide that language support needed. And finally, I planned with the ELA teachers to align the lessons and skills so that students could have more at-bats at practicing the strategies they needed for both ELA and social studies to be more successful there.
Created using Powtoon.